This is Demetria recording a quick intro right before Isaac's intro. Isaac forgot when we sat down to record this episode how extremely jam-packed his itinerary for this trip was. So, to prevent this episode from running ridiculously over History of Japan's normal 30-minute time, I've split this episode up into two roughly 30-ish minute parts. The final part of our conversation about our trip to Japan will be released next week.
Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 497, where we're just going to get right back into it. Last week we were doing some discussions of travels in Japan with our special guest star, my co-traveler, and also, astonishingly, my spouse, Demetria, who is here to talk a little bit more about some of the other things we saw in Japan, what we recommend, what we don't, and give a little perspective on, visiting the country both from my nerdy history perspective and Demetria's interested non-expert perspective. What was cool? What wasn't cool? Yeah, ready to get into it?
Yeah, if you think we've talked a lot about shrines and temples so far, you ain't heard nothing yet.
Okay, well, now that you've said that, I feel like we have to immediately talk about Nara. So those of you who listen to the podcast, of course, remember that Nara was one of the old capitals of Japan. Before Kyoto, Nara was the capital back. Oh, now this is the part where I have to do a poll from my head, and I don't want to embarrass myself. I believe it was 710 was when the capital moved to Nara. That sounds right. And so it was there for about a century in the 700s. And even after the Imperial court relocated a little bit to the north to Kyoto, Nara remained a center of religious power and was really until the modern day home of these incredibly influential and wealthy temple complexes, as well as a couple of very important shrines. So, Demetria, what stood out to you in Nara? Tell me of your Nara memories.
I remember this definitely being one of the places that was, we talked about a bit, we were really interested in a lot of the architecture in the cities we were in. And places like Tokyo obviously have very, very different zoning laws from the US. And of course, Tokyo quite heavily affected in World War II by obviously massive amounts of being bombed. So a lot of the historic buildings did not survive that. Nara, however, has an entire street that is still functionally, 1800s in design?
So that actually raises a good question that I don't know the answer to immediately, because I know Kyoto was on a no-bomb list because they were thinking of testing one of the atomic bombs there. Nara wasn't, to my knowledge, but also it wasn't really... I don't think there were any strategic industries, even by the very loose definition used in World War II. So I don't know if it was ever bombed, but there is a lot of like even like some pre-Meiji architecture that's still there, or that's some early 20th century stuff that has survived down to the present day.
Yeah, it's definitely not in the sense that sometimes you end up with these sort of little pockets of historic buildings that are like kind of tourist traps. As much as I love the French Quarter in New Orleans, very much designed to just sort of exist for the tourists mostly these days. Nara, however, people were still living in those historic houses. Those were just normal neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's pretty cool going through Naramachi, which is the shopping area just next to the park. There's obviously some stuff that's catering to tourists, but at least from what I saw, it looked like there were actually regular locals shopping there too. There were restaurants serving the locals, and it didn't take that long to get into genuine residential territory. It didn't feel like this weird tourist area that was cordoned off from the rest of the city. Which it's cool, you know?
One of Isaac's favorite things that he saw in Nara was the deer that are sort of semi-tame. They're still wild animals, but they have been hanging out in Nara for a millennia or so, eating stuff from tourists. He saw them commuting from the park where they sleep to the park where the tourists feed them. And at the same time, a businessman with a briefcase was commuting to work. And everyone was just kind of commuting together. It was a very interesting
It
juxtaposition.
was truly incredible, and I so regret not being able to get a photo, but it was like right when I woke up and looked out the window. Just this exhausted salaryman utterly ignoring the family of deer, the like the I guess the doe and the like little kid deer. I forget what the word for that is. Just
Fawns.
being, yeah, fawns, thank you. Being kind of chivied along and everyone just being like, "All right, another day at the office." It was a very somehow a truly magically Japanese moment. But yeah, the deer. Let's talk about the deer. What'd you think of the deer?
I loved the deer. I mean, I always love the chance to pet an animal, and the deer at Nara are very well cared for. There's a whole industry devoted not just to feeding them the nutritionally proper food, but making sure tourists don't feed them the wrong things. My favorite thing about the deer, actually, is that we went to a museum where we saw pictures of people admiring the cherry blossoms and feeding the deer rice cakes. And there was a deer that was eating something it shouldn't be eating out of a baby's hand on this woodblock print that was, what, about 200 years old?
Thereabouts. It was late Tokugawa.
And then we went right outside and we saw the cherry blossoms and the deer standing under them, eating things out of tourists' hands and eating something that they shouldn't have been eating out of a tourist's hand. And it really felt like you were connected to history in that moment.
It really is beautiful how long the deer of Nara have been huckstering tourists. And I mean, my very first trip to Nara back in, I think it was 2006, I was back when we still had physical maps. I remember I was not paying much attention, and a deer literally ate the map out of my pocket while I was not looking. So they're very cute, but keep an eye on those little bastards.
They really do bow. And I can definitely see we did a lot of talking while we were in Nara about the history of why Nara was the way it was, and how it had been a pilgrimage destination for so long. And you can definitely feel, if I am a pilgrim and I have crossed the country to get to this place with all of these temples, and one of the first things I see is the deer comes up to me and bows. I mean, that would feel pretty spiritually significant to me.
It's a pretty cool feeling, and there's really, I mean, nothing I've seen that's quite like it. The only other place, honestly, is actually also in Japan. If you go to Itsukushima, the deer there behave pretty similarly, for somewhat similar reasons. But yeah, Nara is singular, and it's worth a trip, particularly because Nara Park, which is where the deer hang out, and then the kind of three main destination areas, Todaiji and Kofukuji, which are two of the major temples in the city, and then Kasuga Shrine, the major Shinto shrine in the city. They're all, what, maybe a 15-minute walk from each other, something like that?
About that, yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty close together. So it's pretty easy to see kind of the heart of what makes Nara famous in a day or so. Todaiji is the one also with the giant Buddha statue. What are your thoughts on the giant Buddha?
Okay, I had by this point gotten a little bit shrined out because we had seen a lot of
Don't know
shrines
what
and
you're
temples.
talking about.
And I was a little reluctant to go to this, and you convinced me to go. And I'm glad I went, because no matter how big you think that Buddha statue is, I guarantee you it is bigger. That is a humongous Buddha statue.
It is pretty wild. Like, you can see photos of it online, obviously, and they give you some sense of the scale. But there's nothing quite like sitting, like, by the Buddha's foot and getting a sense of, like, oh, that foot is bigger than me. And then there's, like, the rest of the statue.
Yeah, we had some really good talks in Nara about the history of tourism and the way people used those pilgrimage passes to move around the country. This is also something I get really interested in Europe, because when you have a something like a cathedral presented to you as a tourist in Europe, oftentimes the curation treats it solely as a place of worship and doesn't really engage with something that I find much more interesting, which is that a lot of those were basically created to be tourist destinations and to get some money out of tourists. And I really liked, I would say a lot of the shrines and temples, particularly in Nara, were very upfront about that history. They're still definitely places of worship, but they also do understand that they exist for tourists to go to.
Yeah, it's one of the kind of cooler aspects of the history. As Demetria mentioned, back in the Tokugawa period, when you needed a pass to move between feudal domains, the easiest way to get one was to say you were going on a religious pilgrimage. And so religion became this sort of tourist trade almost. And Nara really highlights that history, that for a long time, what made this city in the mountains, where you can't really farm or do any of traditional economic activity, the two things that really made it work were tourism and sake brewing, because Nara was one of the first culture centers in the whole country. Though obviously, sake culture has spread quite a bit in the intervening centuries.
I believe it was in Nara. I think it was in Nara. We might have seen some of it in Kyoto too. Those illustrated sort of guidebooks for tourists that could be hundreds of years old. A bunch of museums have those on display. So yeah, the history of tourism in Japan is very long and very established, and I got really interested in that.
I believe in Nara, the ones we saw, there's a museum attached to Kasuga Shrine that has a bunch of the shrine's old like treasures and whatnot. I believe they were in there. And I do definitely recommend that museum. Kasuga Shrine itself is free, so is the grounds of Kofukuji. But if you want to see their like artistic collections, you have to pay. And then Todaiji, you also have to pay to go on the grounds. Kasuga Shrine is free, but the museum is worth a trip. And I mean, all of it's pretty cheap. I think the most expensive ticket was like 800 yen.
Yeah,
Um,
especially by Seattle standards, no museum in Japan was expensive.
Other than the Sword Museum, which was a fucking ripoff.
Even then, still quite cheap by Seattle standards.
I'm still mad about that one. Um, but definitely check out the Kasuga Museum. The one kind of weird thing about it, Japanese like Shinto shrines, for interesting religious reasons and historical reasons, tend to swing very politically conservative, and you see a little bit of that in the curation there, which just treats a lot of Japanese mythology very matter of factly, and kind of talks about Shinto in this language of it being like this unifying cultural characteristic that somewhat echoes some right-wing rhetoric from kind of right-wing political Shinto societies, but it's not as like overtly ultra nationalistic as like Yasukuni Shrine. It's not like that level or anything close to it. It's just something, if you know a little bit about the politics of Shinto, it again swings more kind of conservative, pro LDP, pro like political conservatism, and you see a little bit of that in how some of the stuff is talked about and organized.
Yes, I found both of the museums that we went to in Nara very English friendly in the sense that everything was really well captioned in English. I didn't have any difficult time navigating the museum itself. But again, for the Shinto Museum, Isaac did have to point out a bit of a hidden agenda going on in some of the way some of those artifacts were presented. The Buddhist Museum, really amazing, rare, gorgeous artwork. But again, I found it had the same issue that I ran into a lot in Japan, where they were expecting anyone who spoke English to engage with the art as art. Really did not give a lot of context about who a lot of the people being depicted in these very well preserved wooden statues were, or what they meant in the greater sort of Buddhist mythology. Really, I could have used a little bit more explanation of what exactly was going on there and why these people were significant.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of like Buddhism is one of my areas of weaker knowledge, and I did my best to explain stuff, but it can be very challenging, and especially like older esoteric Buddhism, which is a lot of what you see in the temples in Nara. Um, there is a complicated cosmology there that would say at best I have the loosest of handles on, and that's maybe a little over optimistic. So just know that going in. Two more things to talk about in Nara, both of which were just delightful parts of our personal experience there. Let's talk about the sake brewery we visited.
Yes, we had a lovely time going to a very local little sake brewery.
Harushika is the name. It's in Naramachi, a little bit south of Nara Park, easily walkable. And I just found it through Google reviews. I wanted to do at least one brewery while we were there, and this one was very well reviewed. And I can see why.
Yeah, if you want to taste some weird sake, well, not weird, they were delicious sakes, but some unusual sake and learn a bit about it, great place to go.
And then the other thing we did afterwards was I took Demetria out for what I would say is probably not your favorite bit of Japanese cuisine because you are a big sushi fiend. But it would you say it rose in your estimation?
Okay, first we have to set the scene for what we did because we went from sake to you said, now we have to experience my favorite Japanese drinking experience. We have to go to a convenience store and get a really cheap bottle of whiskey and drink it by a pond because there are no open container laws in Japan. So we did that. We waxed philosophical by a pond for a while. We were good and toasted on, I would say, actually really good whiskey for the
Yeah, I
very
think
small amount we paid.
we got the Suntory Black, which for a little tiny, like I think 250 milliliter bottle was like 250, 300 yen, so a little bit less than, oh god, I can't do this much math in my head. Like, or maybe a little over $3.
And then we stumbled into a completely random okonomiyaki joint, which was incredibly delicious.
Yes, the place we went to, we did track it down afterwards, is called Omitsu. If you're in Nara, strongly recommend. I guess tell the Tencho I sent you. Um, it's got a decently English friendly menu, though I did my best after a little bit of whiskey to order in Japanese. But it is also the classic salty okonomiyaki experience. If you've never had that particular cuisine before, it's basically a chef working a griddle right in front of you, where they combine like noodles and this batter and protein and vegetables and kind of fry it up into this little pancake, and then you eat it with various sauces of your choosing. And it's kind of the classic like workman food. You know, you go in there and there's a like a salty old middle-aged Japanese man who, you know, pours you some soju while he's also kind of watching the TV that will always have some old 70s Jidaigeki on there, and then just kind of, you know, have a kind of very sparse but also very deep conversation with you while kind of frying up your business. It's truly beautiful, and if you've never done it, okonomiyaki is really a Kansai specialty to my understanding. So if you're in the kind of Kyoto, Osaka, Nara area, I've also had it in Hiroshima where it's quite big. Definitely try this out because it's really great food and it's not something you find very easily in the US.
Yes. Oh, should we talk very briefly about the shrine we didn't go into, but the shrine of that very hyper local monkey god?
Oh god, I should have written the name down. Oh, this was interesting and actually probably will, okay, will be a future History of Japan episode at some point, because it turns out Nara has an interesting kind of hyper local Shinto offshoot, that is kind of grounded in some Chinese superstition as well. Um, and oh Lord, I can't remember what the name of the deity in question is. We're gonna do an episode on it at some point, though. It will happen. I promise this.
All right. I have some pictures I can put in the show notes for you when you do that episode because we
Oh,
took some pictures there.
good shout. I drew a complete blank in putting that in my notes too. All right, speaking of places I did draw a complete blank on, this is also a time for a mea culpa as we talk about the city of Osaka. I did not give Osaka its due. I had only been there once in 2006 in my very first trip to Japan, and pretty much all we did was the like ultra touristy thing. We went to Osaka Castle, went up inside. It's not the original castle, now it's a very touristy museum. And I just remember being very kind of like about it. And so I didn't really budget much time or really think that much about going to Osaka at all. And I did that city profoundly dirty. And the big old history of Osaka I did a few months ago was my apology for not properly, not putting the respect on the name of Osaka that it really deserved. So that's my bad, guys. I only budgeted, I think, 2 days there, and it should have been a lot longer because Osaka is really cool.
Although we actually did not get to see Osaka Castle because, like every other tourist, we went straight for Osaka Castle and the line there was incredibly long.
Yeah, honestly, I don't recommend Osaka Castle because A, it's not the original. Um, and B, like, I recommend going to the Osaka Castle Public Park, which is totally free. You can walk around. There's a little like you can get in a little boat and ride around the moat. That's very fun. There's a lot of lovely trees, good cherry blossoms if it's that time of year. But the actual castle is more interesting to look at from the outside as a recreation of the original ones. There were several Osaka castles, as your listeners know. It's I don't think it's really worth going inside. Maybe it's changed. The last time I was there was 2006, but I remember it being again very touristy, more of a museum than an attempt to, or more of a even more of like a theme park feel than an attempt to really recreate the castle experience. And you're not that far from Himeji. If you want to see a castle, go see Himeji Castle. I really think it's way more worth it. Osaka Castle also has crazy lines during tourist season. I think we decided not to go in when we found out it would take an hour to get inside.
Oh, way over an hour.
So, what I recommend instead, again, listeners know that Osaka Castle used to be an armory for the Imperial Japanese Army back in the day. And one of the original armory buildings is still right next to the castle. Go inside that. There's a cafe on the top floor, and you can get a nice whiskey highball or whatever you like to drink and sit up on the rooftop deck and take in beautiful views of the city and the castle. That's what you should do when you go to the park. Don't bother with the castle itself unless you are really desperate for some castle action.
Yes, so we went up there, we had ourselves a drink and looked at the castle and laughed at all the people who were getting heat stroke in line waiting for the castle. And then we went down to the basement of that building and saw a very unusual museum.
Yeah, I think this. Would you say this was your favorite museum? Obviously, I guess second favorite after the Museum of Territory and Sovereignty, right?
I I really had a great time at this museum. It was an example of a kind of museum that I don't think America does as much as Japan does, of the just sort of every single company has a museum dedicated to how great they are and how great their products are somewhere in the country.
Yeah, it's a very. I mean, I think of it as a very Japanese thing, and these are often completely insane. If we ever go to Sapporo, I remember going to the Meiji chocolate one, and I was sick when I did, and I can't remember how much of the insane stuff I saw in there was fever dreams I was having versus reality. But stuff like that is always great. The one in right next to Osaka Castle is the Kyoto Figure Museum. Kyoto makes like these plastic model figurines that are, of course, a big part of nerd culture in Japan and Japan adjacent areas, so to speak. And they had some wild stuff in there. I mean, I love the Alien franchise, and they had some incredibly detailed alien models. Those were really cool. They had some awesome history models. I remember really nerding out over some of those. What were some of the ones that stuck to you?
Well, I didn't really recognize a lot of people in the room that we called the waifu room. There were a lot of sexy anime babes who were complete mysteries to me. Isaac almost choked drinking his water right there.
Try not to spray water all over the microphone. I don't think that's good for it. I don't think the official name was the waifu room, but honestly, that captures the energy very well.
But what really fascinated me is it seemed like a lot of the way that this company makes its money today is making those figures for gashapon toys. Those gashapon, basically, you pay a small amount of money and it gives you a random toy from a collection. And there are these gigantic stores all over Japan just full of these machines. And I got really fascinated by these. They're kind of the same concept of, I mean, I love a Kinder Egg. From my time in Europe as a kid, love a Kinder Egg. It's basically a Kinder Egg without the chocolate and with a slightly larger toy. Really gorgeously detailed models and really incredible array of things you can get. Like Isaac said, lots of history themed stuff, actually. I recall we used our tokens that we got at the museum on a Buddhist figurine
We
one.
did,
So
yes.
yeah, there's absolutely no idea of like it would be inappropriate to make a bunch of Buddhist models that you can get in a little gambling toy game. So all kinds of reproductions of famous artifacts. So there are a bunch of history artifact archaeology themed ones. And then a bunch of really wacky ones like animals pooping on toilets and stuff like that. Actually, I got really fascinated by there was a very popular one that was in all of the Gashapon stores where you could get a miniature temperature gun, like people use to take your temperature to make sure that you don't have COVID. And that was such a product of just a really specific time and place in history.
There's a gashapon for every occasion, and honestly, I think they make great souvenirs. So if you're in the country and you're looking for something that's not gonna break the bank, but is like a fun thing to bring back, whoever you're buying for, there's probably some weird gashapon thing you can find that they'll be into. So definitely check that out. And if you like that kind of figurine stuff, the Kyoto figure museum is really interesting. It's pretty cheap to get into. And you can take all kinds of cool photos of the weird models they have in there, and then realize how much anime there is that you don't know about. The one thing I would say is if you have small kids, some of them figurines do be a little saucy in the way that anime can be a little saucy. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, I wouldn't call any of it inappropriate for a child, but it's there's some boobs. It's booby.
Booby, I think, is a good way to describe it. And from that museum to the last, or a very different type of museum, nearby is the Osaka History Museum, which we went to after Osaka Park, or like the Castle Park. What did you think of that?
I am having a very difficult time remembering the difference between the Osaka and the Kyoto History Museums.
The one with the elevator where we went to the top, and there was the room with the fake Imperial audience chamber, and then you work your way down as you go through history, and it had all
Oh,
the models and
okay.
stuff.
Yes, I actually thought this was my favorite museum in Japan, but it would have been completely incomprehensible if I was not with a Japanese speaker because
Yeah,
it's an incredibly well curated museum, but some of the most fun parts of curation actually are happening in audio form. So even if you have a pretty good image translator on your phone, it is not going to work in this museum.
yeah. The English descriptors for the artifacts are few and far between. The Japanese is far more comprehensive, and there's a lot of really fun audio stuff happening. One of my favorite bits, there is a scale model of one of the merchant quarter areas in Osaka in the Tokugawa period, and there's a whole like narrative where there's a guy taking you through his day, and he runs into some samurai brawling. I think he runs into Fukuzawa Yukichi at one point. Um, and there's a whole kind of narrative there, and it is completely inaccessible if you cannot understand Japanese. So
Well, you're
it
missing out on one of the most fascinating parts of this, which it is narrated by a bunraku puppet.
Oh yes, that was very cool. Yeah, I guess the idea was the puppet was the spirit of someone who had lived during the time period. I might have missed some introductory language because I was very excited about the models. But yeah, it's a really cool museum. It's not English friendly though.
Yeah, the models are incredibly detailed and they are designed to show street scenes from different periods in really amazing detail with a lot of really fun little bits of things sort of happening at street level, really individualized figures. I really, really loved this museum. I had a hard time taking pictures because a lot of them are very, very small scale models, but really amazing museum. And they really go through a big chunk of history too, because they go all the way from a very, very old imperial Palace all the way up to Meiji era. They had a lot of really fun exhibits, and actually kind of a fake street scene from the 1920s, I think,
Yeah,
was it?
the
Yeah.
20s,
Yeah, so
which
they,
was
they even
also
go like
really cool.
post Meiji era. Yeah, so they cover a lot of ground in this museum.
It's very detailed and really cool, and definitely again worth a trip. But make sure you have someone who has like a decent handle on the language. Um, I also love it because that little fake throne room area is the closest I'll ever get, of course, to my audience with the Emperor, which I so richly deserve. But that's okay. Genius is often not recognized in its time. And then the last thing we did in Osaka was wander a little bit around Shinsekai, which is one of the kind of 20th century, early 20th century kind of touristy areas. Um, a lot of little stalls, good places to eat. We didn't spend a huge amount of time here. I think my favorite bit was the Korean street food vendors. Osaka has one of the bigger Zainichi, like Koreans resident in Japan populations. We found a really cool little stall where they were very excited to feed us lots of delicious food.
Yeah, I confess that jet lag was hitting me very hard on this day. So I didn't have the strongest memories of this because I was almost falling asleep for it. It was really cool to go down there, though, although I am having an argument with Isaac about it, which is that Osaka is one of the places in the country where you can get extraordinary cheap pufferfish meat. And Isaac thought it was unsafe to try this.
I'm just not rolling them bones. I'm not a gambler.
And I looked it up, and apparently, a lot of the pufferfish sold in Japan now is actually farmed through a method where they are kept in tanks and they do not eat the thing that makes their liver poisonous. And that is why it's so cheap. I have a lot of trust in the Japanese government not allowing tourists to do things that would be in any way dangerous. And if stores are selling $5 pufferfish skewers, I have a lot of faith that the government would not be letting that happen if there was any meaningful amount of risk there.
I
So,
I absolutely believe that that is true. I'm still not going to do it though.
so I
Uh,
did not try any fugu, but I could have, sir. I could have.
live your truth, chase your dreams. I will stick to other things that can be deep fried. And with all that said, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. For now, I just want to say this show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. And you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Before I get into our patron shoutouts, I also want to remind those of you who don't already know, though if you've listened to the recent episodes in the feed, you should know this. We have another podcast together, Criminal Records. It's all about strange cases of criminal history and what they tell us about the times they're from. Entertaining things we've done recently include gangs in Japan. Some how would you even describe that like Stuart period weird sex politics murder case?
I would say I've been describing it as the case of the poisoned enema, although let me tell you, only a fraction of how weird it really is.
Yeah, so if that sounds like your type of thing, go check it out. We do all kinds of weird and wild stuff on there, and it's a lot of fun to put together. And some of the people who enable us in our pursuit of weird history are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thank you all for listening, and go visit Japan. It's really cool.